The sea was quiet, too quiet. Not a wave dared to speak. Not a gull dared to cry. The morning sun rose like a pale coin over an empty horizon, and somewhere in that vast blue silence, fate was preparing its sharpest blade. What was about to happen would not just shift the course of a battle, it would reshape the future of the world itself. It was June 1942, only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese Empire seemed unstoppable. City after city had fallen, fleet after fleet had burned, and the rising sun banner flew from Asia to the Pacific like a storm without an end. The United States was still bleeding, still reeling, still trying to understand how a world could change overnight. Most people believed Japan would win. Many believed America could not recover. But history doesn't bend to the strongest, or the fastest, or even the most prepared. Sometimes history bends to the invisible. To a code no one thought could be broken. To a message intercepted by men nobody knew. To a handful of pilots whose fuel tanks were almost empty. To 6 minutes of fire, steel, and impossible luck. This is not the story of who had the bigger navy. This is not the story of who fired first. This is the story of a turning point, of destiny collapsing in real time. A moment when the tide of war shifted, not because it was supposed to, but because a few men refused to let it go any other way. This is the story of Midway. Not the version in textbooks. Not a list of dates and names. But the heartbeat of the battle, the fear, the chaos, the mistakes, the voices inside the smoke. The coded whispers inside a dark basement in Pearl Harbor. The pilots whose hands were shaking but did not turn back. The Japanese commanders who never knew they were already defeated. The American carriers standing against impossible odds like 3 lone towers in a burning sea. Everything will come down to 6 minutes. And when those 6 minutes are over, the empire that once seemed untouchable will never rise to power again. Now, step into the storm. The eyes of the world were blind, but a small group of men had already seen the future. The story of Midway does not begin with guns, or bombs, or steel. It begins in silence, in a basement, in a place where the air smelled like sweat, ink, and burned out nerves. It begins with men who fought without ever touching a weapon. Their names were unknown to the world. Their ranks were low. Their uniforms were plain. But they were about to do something no army had accomplished in thousands of years of warfare. They were about to read the enemy's mind. Station Hypo sat deep beneath Pearl Harbor, an underground intelligence center lit by rattling lamps and filled with endless strings of paper, typewriters, and cigarette smoke that never cleared. It was a place where sleep was a rumor and time had no meaning. Here, men listened to radio waves like fishermen listening for ghosts in deep water. The man who led them was Joseph Rochefort. His coat was a bathrobe. His hair was a mess. He rarely saluted and often forgot to shave. He looked like someone who belonged in a library, never on the front lines of a world war. But Rochefort and his small team of crypt analysts were about to become the most dangerous men in the Pacific, because they were unlocking the most valuable weapon of all. Information. Japan's secret naval code was called JN-25, a massive encryption system with over 30,000 possible symbols. The Japanese believed it was unbreakable, and in a way, they were right. It was unbreakable, at least to anyone fighting a normal war. But Rochefort wasn't fighting a normal war. He had learned to read patterns the way a hunter reads footprints in snow. He had learned to hear rhythm in numbers, to see meaning in fragments. Most days, he sat barefoot on the floor, staring at sheets of intercepted transmissions like they were ancient prophecies. His team slept on cots, ate from tin cans, and rarely saw daylight. The world outside was drowning in fire and blood. But down here, where no bomb could reach, war was fought on paper. And slowly, painfully, the walls of Japanese secrecy began to crack. 3 weeks before the battle, Rochefort noticed something strange. The Japanese fleet was preparing a major operation, but they never said the target's name. They called it only by one code, AF. Nobody knew what AF was. The army thought it was the Aleutians. Some believed it was Hawaii. Others believed it was a deception. But Rochefort had a feeling that no numbers could prove, only instinct. He believed AF was Midway. Midway was a tiny coral island, halfway between Asia and America, barely a dot on the map. But it was the last line of defense before the Japanese could reach Hawaii again. If Midway fell, the door to the United States would swing wide open. Rochefort needed proof, so he came up with a plan. He told the base at Midway to send an uncoded message, plain language, no encryption, claiming that their freshwater system was broken and they were running out of drinking water. They waited. A day later, Tokyo transmitted a message in JN-25. AF is short of water. That was it. That was the moment the entire war tilted. Rochefort ran to command with the decoded message in his hands, and suddenly, the impossible became clear. Japan was coming to Midway. And now, America knew. But knowing was not enough. Because even if the U.S. Navy knew where Japan was headed, they still had almost no chance of stopping them. Japan was bringing the largest carrier strike force ever assembled, 4 frontline carriers, veteran pilots, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the deadliest aircrew the world had ever seen. America had 3 carriers, half-trained aviators, and more luck than strategy. The numbers were suicide, but the battle was already changing, not in the skies, not on the ships, but in the quiet place where war turns into destiny. In the space between what one side knows and the other side thinks they know. And Japan still believed they were invisible. They were not. Hourglass next message, part 2, loading, just say, continue. Fire part 2 The trap is set, cinematic continuous narration, no skip, no list, no script notes. Approximately 2500-3000 words. The ocean was a mirror, vast, empty, and deceptively calm. Beneath that glass-like surface, the Pacific hid the greatest naval ambush in history, one that only a handful of men even knew was coming. Before dawn on June 3, 1942, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz stood on the deck of his flagship. He stared across the dark water, listening to the wind like a man listening to fate. He had spent his life in the Navy, 41 years as a sailor, a strategist, a quiet and unshakable thinker. Now, everything he had ever learned would be tested in a single fight. Nimitz wasn't a man of fire and speeches. He didn't roar, he didn't brag, he planned. Calmly. Precisely. He knew America's naval strength was still almost nothing compared to Japan's. He knew every ship he sent to Midway could be lost. But he also knew one thing the Japanese did not. He already knew where they were coming. Japan's plan, designed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was brilliant, on paper. It was wrapped in deception, timing, and overwhelming force. They would strike Midway, destroy any American carriers that responded, and force the United States to negotiate peace. It was the final push to break American resolve. But the very brilliance of Yamamoto's plan depended on one thing: surprise. And surprise was gone. In a basement full of scattered papers and sleepless codebreakers, the balance of power in the Pacific had already shifted. Nimitz studied every report from Rochefort's cryptologists. He trusted them more than the admirals who doubted them. He trusted numbers over pride. He trusted logic over emotion. And because of that trust, he made the greatest gamble of his life. Instead of waiting to defend Midway, he would ambush the ambushers. The carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered USS Yorktown had already been ordered to take position northeast of the island, exactly where the Japanese fleet did not expect them to be. The U.S. Navy was about to bet its future on 3 ships and a few hundred aviators. And many of those aviators had never even seen combat. The morning of June 4 came like a blade through fog. The first alarm sounded at 0534. Enemy planes inbound. On the horizon, high in the sunlight, the sky shimmered with the approach of more than 100 Japanese aircraft. Bombers and fighters swept toward Midway like a moving fragment of night, engines growling, wings glinting like knives. The first bombs hit Sand Island. Everything shook. Fire rolled across the fuel tanks. Barracks exploded. The airfield turned into shrapnel. Marines crawled across scorched earth, dazed, bleeding, praying they could still fire back. But the defenders of Midway refused to break. The sky above the base turned into a swirling hell of tracer fire and falling wings. Pilots took off with smoke in their eyes and death in their teeth. Some climbed only a few hundred feet before they were torn apart. Others kept climbing, because there was no other choice. They flew and died, again and again. But their courage was not wasted. Because while Japan believed they had knocked out Midway's air power, something else, something far more important, was happening in the distance. 3 American carriers were sitting silently in the open ocean, engines idling, every pilot strapped in, every torpedo armed, every deck trembling with the weight of tension. And they were waiting for only one signal. Target sighted. At 0700, that message arrived. A scout plane from Midway spotted the main Japanese carrier strike group, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the same carriers that struck Pearl Harbor. This was not just a battle anymore. This was justice. The flight decks buzzed alive. Crews sprinted. Torpedoes clamped into place. Planes were rolled into the open, engines screaming, propellers clawing at the air. One moment the sky was clear, and the next, American dive bombers were slicing through the sun like arrows of fire. Their wings trembled, their canopies shook, and the pilots clenched their teeth as the ocean spun upward in a blur. They had been lost for nearly an hour, fuel almost gone, radios dead, hope fading. And then, at the last possible second, fate revealed the Japanese fleet directly beneath them, exposed, busy, unprepared. In war, there are hours that pass like decades, and there are decades that pass in minutes. This moment would last only 6. The first bomb struck Kaga. It punched through the flight deck and disappeared into the fuel lines below. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the ship erupted like a volcano. Flames rose hundreds of feet as bombs detonated on the hangar deck, tearing the carrier's steel heart open. Pilots still waiting to take off were thrown through fire and smoke. Some never knew what hit them. Seconds later, Akagi was hit. A single bomb. Just one. It fell through an elevator opening and detonated among torpedoes and fully fueled aircraft. The explosion shredded everything it touched. Walls peeled like skin. Men were vaporized. Flames launched into the sky like a signal to the gods. Then came Soryu. Her decks were covered with aircraft, neatly aligned, fuel lines open, ammunition stacked, and then the sky fell. A rain of fire. 3 bombs ripped through her, turning metal into molten light. The ship shuddered, split, and burned like a living thing. 3 carriers destroyed in 5 minutes, by men who should have been dead, by planes that almost turned back, by a strike that wasn't supposed to work. Japan was shocked, but not defeated. Because one carrier still remained afloat. Hiryu. And she would not go quietly. Within minutes, Hiryu launched her counterattack. Her pilots were the elite of the elite, the veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, and the Indian Ocean. They dove straight at USS Yorktown, their aim perfect, their timing merciless. Bombs dropped with precision and tore through Yorktown's deck, igniting fires and crippling engines. Smoke rose like a funeral banner. But Yorktown refused to die. Damage crews fought the flames, sealed the bulkheads, pumped out flooding compartments. The ship steadied. She kept moving. She was wounded, but alive. Japan thought she was sinking. So when Hiryu launched her second wave, they aimed again at the same ship. But this time their target was a ghost. Yorktown had been repaired so well, so fast, that the Japanese thought she was a different carrier entirely. That mistake sealed Hiryu's fate. Because while she was recovering aircraft, rearming, and preparing for another strike, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown were already on their way. They found her in the late afternoon, turning into the wind, vulnerable like the others had been that morning. From 14,000 feet, the Americans dove again. The ocean roared. Wind screamed through the canopies. The ship grew larger and larger beneath them, like a target waiting for judgment. Then the bombs fell. The first ripped through her forward deck. The second hit amidships. The third wiped out her hangar. The fourth turned her flight deck into a firestorm. Hiryu burned for hours, her proud flag still flying until she finally slipped into the Pacific and disappeared beneath the waves. 4 carriers gone. 4 shiploads of elite pilots lost forever. Japan's naval power, built over decades, was undone in a single day. But the cost was not over. Yorktown, battered beyond saving, eventually succumbed to torpedo strikes and rolled onto her side. Men cried as they abandoned her. She had survived what no ship should survive, and she had done her duty. The ocean accepted her slowly, with dignity. When the news reached Tokyo, the truth was unbearable. Japan had not simply lost ships. Japan had lost the war, though they would fight on for years, refusing surrender, trying to drag fate back into their hands. But fate had already spoken. Midway was not just a battle. It was a turning point. A shift in momentum so sharp that the Pacific itself seemed to breathe again. America would no longer fight for survival. America would fight for victory. Every island, every sea, every mile of ocean would now move in the other direction, toward Tokyo. And it all began with a message intercepted, a code broken, a gamble taken, a squadron that never came home, a group of pilots who refused to turn back, and 6 minutes of fire that ripped an empire apart. When the war finally ended and peace returned to the world, Rochefort received almost no recognition. His work remained classified, his efforts ignored, his brilliance buried under medals given to others. He never complained. He simply smiled, said little, and returned to the quiet life he had always lived. Admiral Nimitz later said that if it were not for Rochefort and his team, the United States would have lost the Battle of Midway, and perhaps the entire Pacific War. And somewhere beneath the sea, the iron bones of the Japanese carriers still rest in silence, surrounded by currents and ghosts, forever locked in the moment that changed the world. The Battle of Midway lasted only a few days. The outcome was decided in 6 minutes. But its impact will echo for centuries. Because in the end, war is not always won by strength. Not by size. Not by fear. Sometimes it is won by a codebook, a hunch, a moment of madness, and the courage to dive, even when you know you may never climb back up. That was Midway. That was the moment destiny shifted, and the world never looked the same again.